Yeah, we just need to get
Marker.
this going.
How do people do business with the Rural Bank? What kinds of things were you lending them money for, and how'd they come in and work with you?
Most of our customers, they dealt with us personally, and we would, if we had to have extra money, we'd have to go to the World Bank to get it, or the Federal Reserve Bank. And but they didn't deal with them personally. Our customers did not. We done that ourselves, and that was where they looked to us for their financial guidance, their financial needs, and all of that. However, in the years back, in the early days, they realized that the banks were limited to the amount of money they had because deposits were very small compared to now that we have inflation. Why it seemed very small. But
So
they
when did people come in to get money? What did they come to get money for?
most of our rural people, they wanted to make a crop with, and they would come in after the 1st of January. We didn't start making loans for agricultural things until after January the 1st, and we'd make those, and we'd make most of them come due in the autumn or fall of the year, which was usually October the 1st, and some of them, of course, would have to ride over maybe 30 days or such matter, but then that was where we loaned our money to them, was right after the 1st of the years as they came in. Of course, naturally they couldn't all get in one day, but then we would usually, the month of January was our big month of loaning money.
And so was there a lot of borrowing and expansion of agriculture going on in the 1920s? Were people trying to buy new land and build stuff up, or
Well, it was
was it a good time?
things were fairly well in the 20s, because they had just gone through the Depression time of right after World War I, in which prices were quite high for farm products, cotton, which is one of our big money crops, and broom corn was one then, and things like that. And cotton got up as high as 45 cents a pound, which a bale of cotton weighs 500 pounds, so you can figure it out. That's $225 for a bale of cotton. And in 1920, then the market started dropping 5 cents per day. So you could not sell your cotton because nobody would buy it because they couldn't sell it quick enough to break even on it. And it went on down to 6 cents a pound, which of course you can figure that out. That's $30 a bale. Well, when you're planning on getting $225 for a bale of cotton and you only get 30, it's hard to pay your debts with it. Or
So now, did the same kind of thing happen again? Can you kind of tell me a similar story about what would happen between 1929 after the market crash, and I guess your prices started tumbling around here about 1930, 31?
Well, with us, in other words, the fellow comes in and he's going to pay for his crops, and he doesn't get as much as he thought he would, and well, next year is going to be better. That's if you're going to be a farmer, you got to look for better times next year, and you make good crops around the stove and all that, but then sometimes it doesn't work that way. But anyway, and like when the crash come in 29 in the stock markets, and then the commodity markets started going down too. Well, the big part of our crop was in 29 before that crash came, which was along the latter part of October, if I recall correctly. And then in 30, it was bad, but you'd been through that before, and you knew it would be all right next year. When it come 31, they were worse. It hadn't gotten better, and so the crash was with us then.
What kinds of things happened to the farmers? What kind of prices were they looking at in those years? Do you remember some of the ways that cotton prices fell, or hogs?
Well, cotton went down, of course, every day, you might say, and it got down as low as 4 cents a pound, which that's only $20 a bale. And if you make a crop like a small farmer might make of, say, 10 bales of cotton, and figured out $20 a bale, that's $200 of your total income for the year. So that didn't leave anything good.
What was it like around here trying to, you used some phrases before about there just wasn't anything to make money with. What was it like? What was the economy of Marlow like when these prices?
Well, it wasn't as bad as maybe I painted to you there, but then one of the things that we had here was that most of our rural people, they had chickens, which they could have eggs and have chickens to eat. They had cows, so they had milk to drink and things like that. But the price of it was down, but of course the prices of everything was down by then. And they had crops. They made some crops, and it didn't go very far. But that was one of the things that we did, is just the crops and the cattle, milk, and had in other words, we had what called cream stations in other words, we milked cows, separated the milk and got cream, and then you brought it into town. And of course, that prices had gone down, but then it would still buy a little coffee and sugar and so forth. But most of our people didn't have to buy very much because they had gardens, they had orchards, and they raised so much of their food, and ladies all canned things for winter use. Not only was produce and things of that nature canned, but even some of them would kill hogs. And of course, you didn't have to can that, but then you'd make sausage and this, that, and the other, and it provided meat for the family for the next year, you see.
Now, you were working in the bank in Marlow.
Sure,
Yep. Okay, we'll stop. You just need to change.
Ira Green, take 2.
Sound speed. So if a farmer came up with this 4 cent a pound cotton, what might he come to the bank and ask you for help about? What was he going up against?
Well, for the most part, they would come in and say, well, I've got to pay the landlord a fourth the rent on this. That only left 15. Could I get by paying $5 on my note? When I was expecting it to pay the whole note off, you see, and that was about the way it run. And of course, then the next year, while you come in to borrow more money, well, you still owe this much, and we just don't have much money, and so we're just doing the best we can on it here. I don't know how we're going to get by. And we'd tell them, and well, he'd tell his neighbor, and his neighbor would come over and look over there and say, save $50 for me, because I've got to have it to make a crop on. And so that happened quite often, really.
Now, did you ever have to go out and foreclose on someone?
Well, of course, you always have that, And,
Could you repeat my question, sort of, or just talk about when I had to foreclose, or sometimes we had to foreclose?
Okay.
Just
when you had to foreclose one, of course, we usually waited until the person had give up on it. And one of the things that happened to us, of course, is that somebody would just walk off from a crop. We call it the owl's got him. But he'd walk off the crop. Well, you have to go out and gather up as much as you can in the way of livestock and what have you, and liquidate it the best you can. But that wasn't good. But some of them you'd have to go out and say, well, you're just too deep in debt. There's no way in the world we can let you have any more money to make a crop with. And he said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll just have to get on the soup line or something or other. And therefore, you have to take charge of the property, whether it's cattle or farm implements or whatever it was.
Was it a horrible feeling?
Oh yes, and you still have that feeling even in these good times. You know, when everything is good, why you still have to go out and repossess. Usually an automobile, you know, and they always got some reason why they can't pay for the automobile. And but if you just give it a little more time, and well, you've already given them more time, and so it's always a unpleasant feeling. And so it's not any better now than what it was then, as far as the feeling of, you know, in other words, you might say taking somebody's property away from them to try to satisfy the debt. And of course, I would say that in most cases, you have a loss in it. You keep going with them because they're friends and neighbors, and you do the best that you can, and you go till you've got a loss in it before you really do that.
Were you aware? That's great. That's just
Yes.
huh? Great.
End of the sound roll.
How we doing?
Marker.
Oklahoma was kind of famous for all these bank robberies that sort of happened, I guess, in the 20s and on into the 30s. Do you remember, as a banker, the kind of crime wave, bank robberies? And
Yes, it was. Most of them were small robberies. By that I mean they was at small banks, and of course it was kind of a disgrace to get robbed by anybody except Pretty Boy Floyd or John Dillinger or Bonnie and Clyde or some of those people, you know. That was, but most of the robberies was done by other people, and it seems that for various reasons, maybe some of them would get together like and talking, and they didn't have any money and didn't have any jobs, and well, I think we're going to rob a bank, and you want to go with us? And they'd get the crew together, and here they'd come.
now, did your bank ever get robbed?
Yes, we got robbed.
Can you tell me that about what happened? What was it like?
That was in November the 7th of 1932, and the whole setup on the robbery of our bank was there was a person who had lived here and familiar with Marlowe, and they were all together in the oil field down at Longview, Texas, and got to talking and then decided to rob the bank. And he said, well, I know one where we can rob it in Marlowe, Oklahoma. And of course, all of this we found out later, of course. Anyway, they come up here, and he stayed out in the country because people would know him. They drove up to the side of the bank, and one of them stayed with the car out there to protect it, and three of them come in the bank. Well, it was always, during those times, there had been so many bank robberies around that it was quite often that a customer would come in and jokingly say, this is a holdup. And so I happened to have my back to the counter at the moment, and this fellow hollered, this is a holdup. And I said, oh, yeah. Turned around, and sure enough, the gun was right in my face. So that made it the robbery, and they, of course, took what money was in the tills, and they made us open the safe and let them have that money. And then, of course, they locked us in the vault and went out. And in the meantime, the alarms had gone off because we had burglar alarms in there, and they one of the places where the alarm was going off, they saw he was fixing to shoot at this fellow that stayed with the car out there, and so they shot at him, and then he shot back at their tires, and then we were inside the vault, and we could hear them shooting out there, and we had no idea what was happening, of course, because and we heard one bullet that they shot back through the window. I don't know why they did that, but they did. They shot one back through the window, and we could hear it ricochet around the brick walls. And then some fella hollered, says, if you tell me the combination, I'll let you out of the vault. We told him, says, go get somebody that we know, because he was just a fellow trying to be helpful, really. But we didn't know. We were safe in the vault, and we wasn't about to unlock. And therefore, about that time, one of the boys that was gone to dinner at the time come back in, and he unlocked the vault and let us out. We were in there with 2 of us employees and 3 customers.
That's quite a story. That's quite a story. When something like that, who had authority to chase after the robber? Did the local police? Did you?
Of course, the local police, and they had the right to it, and the sheriff, had the right to, and of course, I guess anybody who wanted to get into it, and I didn't want into it. I'd already had my dose of it. So then after they leave out, then you, of course, begin to wonder who they were. And at that time, instead of the FBI, it was the Burns Detective Agency that worked out these things for national banks. And so they come as to saying, well, we've got some people we want you to look at to see if they are the ones that robbed your bank. And we'd go look, and no, that's not them. And we'd go, no, that's not them. And so finally, this detective called us I had to come up to Oklahoma City. He says, we've got them. So we go up to Oklahoma City, and he has us to look at them, and we said, no, that's not them, not them. He said, well, we caught them with the money. He said, and well, it's not them. It's not the ones that robbed us. And so we walked outside, and he says, that was what we were doing, was building you the case, because these people I was showing you in there, they robbed one at Childers, Texas last week, and we caught them. And we got some of the money. And of course, he showed us the money. Isn't that the money that come to your place? Well, and says, we wanted to get that information. So I was scared to death, Fred. You'd say, well, I believe it is him. He says, and so, but he says, we know who robbed your bank. And says they are scattered, and said they scattered from Longview, Texas. And he says, the next time I call you, and I won't call you anymore till I have one of them. Well, I'll call you probably from Louisiana. Well, he called in about 2 weeks. Says, we got one of them down here. Says, I'd like for you to come down and identify him, but we can't get him because we caught him robbing a bank down here in Louisiana. He's already robbing another one. And of course,
so it was just all over the map.
Yeah. And so then we went and looked, and yeah, it was him. And he says, the next time we call you, it'll be from probably Dallas, Texas. And it wasn't long till he called, and sure enough, there's one of them there. Mm-hmm. And so on down, and they got all of them. However, the one is Marlowe Boy was that really, I guess the proper word for it, as we used it back then, fingered us. In other words, it picked us out for them to rob. Of course, we couldn't identify him because he was out in the country. And
I want to change the subject now back to Pretty Boy Floyd and these kind of mythic outlaws. How did you were a banker. How did you feel about a character like that becoming kind of a Robin Hood?
He wasn't no Robin Hood to me. I'll put it that way. They were bank robbers, and that's the way I felt about them. Because, it's nice to be a Robin Hood, I'm sure, but if you come and take my bread when I need it to eat and go give it to somebody else, you're not a Robin Hood to me, in other words. So that's the way I felt about bank robbers, and of course that was the only one of that we dealt with that's outside of these fellows that we had. And of course we brought 3 of them back to Stevens County and convicted them and sent them to the penitentiary in Oklahoma.
Did you ever have a feeling, being a banker, that when times got tough during the Depression, the people were getting angry at the banks instead of, do you ever feel that? Would you ever
Oh, well,
experience that?
there's always a little of it, you know. In other words, if a fella owes you more than he can pay, and he comes in and he just got to have a little more money, and well, you just couldn't. And some of them would say, well, old banker, he's eating all right, but he don't know how I feel, you know. And well, it made you feel bad because you loved the people. They were your customers, and you wanted to do everything you could for them. But we wasn't too rich ourselves, so we couldn't just keep putting out the money, and that we knew they couldn't pay back.
I'd like to stop just for a second. So what the Bankers Association do?
Well, of course, it was a cooperative effort by the banks by using some of the money that we paid in as dues to offer rewards for the arrest and conviction of people who had robbed banks. And
Did you also hire people to try to trace down these?
personally, no, we didn't. Our bank did not. Now, as I say, the Burns Detective Agency was hired by the Oklahoma Bankers Association to do the tracing down. And as I told you, the detective, when he come out and told us where he's at, in other words, he was hired by the Oklahoma Bankers Association.
And so would they have wanted posters and stuff for the criminals, and would private citizens get rewards for catching someone, or?
Not that I know of. I know there was the last one of the ones that was in our deal. He was over here at the town of Okima, which is east of Oklahoma City, and we couldn't get him because he was protected by local officers and so forth. But finally he got out of there, and we caught him and brought him in. But we just went over there and to identify him, and the detective went with us and said, well, we'll just take him on to Oklahoma City from here, and I won't have to make another trip.
Oh, great. Okay.
So we did.
So we just ran out of film, so. Yeah.
We're changing to camera roll 312.
What was the? Can you just tell me what was the goal of a rural bank, a small bank like your bank here in Marlow during this period?
Well, we felt then, as we have always felt, that this is our home and we want to make it the best that we possibly can. And even though during the Depression days when it was so hard to do all that you would like to do or wanted to do, we still tried to do that to help the people make crops. One of the things that I've thought about a lot of times was that Mr. McKinney, who was the controlling officer at that time, come to me as a kid and says, there's no banks in Stevens County that is making car loans, and I think we're going to have to make car loans in order to make any money. And I'm going to make you the car loan man, but don't come to me because I'm never going to loan people money to spend their money. I try to loan it to them to make some money to help feed the family. And says, that's going to be your, and that's how I become a loan person, which was back in the very early 30s.
So when someone was running up against not being able to pay back their mortgage, not being able to pay back their debts, how did you try to work with someone, and what did it feel like?
Well, it's we always tried to say, well, come in, let's see if we can't work something out. And if we could say, well, I believe if you put in something else in the way of a crop, or if you will not sell your calves so quick and let them get a little bigger, or all those things, you know, you tried to counsel with them. And, of course, naturally, we didn't have all the answers either, of course, but then a lot of times you could help them understand that they needed do something other that would make them more money and let them have more left over to pay their debts with and whatever they needed to do. And so we done that back then, and this come later, of course, but after we'd always encourage people they raise 10 acres of cotton, well, you need to put in 20, but they come along and the government told them they have to go out and tell people to plow up their cotton. And I know that Mr. McKinney, the one that I mentioned, he and I went out here to a rural school and talked about it, and coming back in, he says, I'm not going back anymore. I said, what's the matter? He says, I've encouraged people to put in more crop, to try to do better, and to go out and tell them to plow it up. So I can't do it.
Can you just tell me again the story about how prices kind of came down just in that early 1930 years? Tell me what a cotton farmer or someone growing broom corn or raising hogs, what kind of price fall they faced and what that might mean for them at the end of the year.
Yes. Well, during the 20s, why mostly the price of cotton was 20 cents a pound. That was standard, which is $100 a bale. And then all at once it began to drop, and it kept going down in 30, 31, and even on beyond that some, and went from the 20 cents a pound down to as low as 4 cents a pound. And to get a perspective of it, 20 cents a pound is $100 a bale, 4 cents a pound is $20 a bale. So you can see if you're planning on paying something other with a $100 bill and you only get 20, it just doesn't go very far. Broom corn, it was selling for about $300 a ton, which was a fair price for it. It got down to $40 per ton, and you had to hire people to cut the broom corn, and they had been paying 25 to 30 cents an hour for that kind of work. One crop was cut for 7.5 cents an hour. I've cashed many a check for a fellow that worked 10 hours cutting broom corn, got a check for 75 cents. The next year it was better, got 10 cents an hour. So it wasn't too much better, but it was some better.
Now, a farmer came to you then at the end of the year, hadn't made his crops, hadn't sold his crops for what he wanted. What was he up against with you and his
Depend on the person altogether nearly, because if you had a person, I recall a couple of brothers come to me, and each one of them owed a balance at the end of the year. They says, we can sell out everything we got and pay you. We won't have anything left. But if you say so, we'll go pay you. You sell it out and pay you. I said, let's go and let's make one more crop. Well, they done pretty good that year, and they worked out, and they lived on the same farms till they were ready to retire. They're, of course, both gone now. But that's, you tried to work it out. People that, we went on the theory, if he's hard worker, he knows what he's doing, and he's honest, stay with him.
That's great. That's great. Do you recall during the Hoover administration if any of the Hoover programs were helping the farmers and the banks here in Marlow? They had the Federal Farm Board, and they had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. I didn't know if those things trickled down to you here and helped folks.
Not enough that we noticed it during the Hoover administration. Most of it, in fact, all of it, I would say around here, come down to us through the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration.
Do you recall the elections of the campaigning during the elections of 1932?
Oh,
Do you remember when Hoover and Roosevelt, did you have any election stories? Do you remember how folks
I
around
don't
here?
have any real stories to tell about it other than the fact that a lot of people would say, I've had all of the Hoover I can stand, and anything has beat that. And so that's about the best stories that I have on it.
That's what you remember, people
yeah.
were saying things like
Yeah.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well that's great. I think I'm ready to cut. This is just, Sarah's just gonna.
Next, I'm going to do room tone for Mr. Ira Green's interview.
So we just need to sit silently for. Okay, I'm recording.
See my son, because
And that's the end of the
I
Ira
realized
Green
that-
interview. End of the Ira Green interview.
End of the sound roll.